что, коллеги, начинаем. Начинаем наше замечательное мероприятие. У нас должен состояться мастер-класс CCIM, инвестиционные решения в недвижимости, владение или аренда, инструменты экспертного анализа. Позвольте представиться, меня зовут Барков Олег. В настоящий момент я являюсь свободным художником на рынке недвижимости. У меня 18 лет опыта работы в недвижимости, девелопменте, консалтинге, генеральном подряде и управлении недвижимостью. И я очень рад представить наших гостей. Сузи Джонс Волкер, президент-брокер компании «Сила». И Робин Веб, президент института CCIM, директор НАИ Real Invest. Я считаю, что наш мастер-класс посвящен очень важной проблеме, потому что мы все живем на нашем рынке. Еще 15 лет никто не задавал вопрос, что более выгодно владеть или арендовать, потому что все хотели владеть. Это была психологическая особенность начального этапа развития рынка недвижимости. Сейчас очень многие люди задают эти вопросы. Очень многие даже частные домовладения начинают составлять финансовые модели и думать, что выгоднее на данном этапе жизни: купить квартиру, арендовать квартиру. Это практически на 100% касается бизнес-решений, потому что еще 15 лет очень многие предприниматели, компании хотели владеть офисом. Сейчас их количество радикально уменьшается. Поэтому будет очень интересно прислушаться к мнению наших коллег, которые имеют очень многолетний успешный опыт в решении этих задач. Suzy, please, let's introduce yourself and a couple of words about you.
Thank you. My name is Suzi Jones Walker, and I am a senior instructor with the CCIM Institute. I teach the beginning course, which is called CI 101, which is about investment analysis. And I also teach CI 103, which is user decision, which is should I lease or should I buy? I have been an instructor for the CCIM Institute for 16 years, and I am currently the chair of education worldwide for CCIM for the year of 2017. I was fortunate enough to come to your conference with our global president, Robin Webb, and it was fortunate since we live in Orlando, Florida, which was having a hurricane while we were flying over here, so it was just convenient too, because you have power and we don't. But with that, I am thrilled to be here and how many of you have ever heard or taken a CCIM course? Anyone? Oh, like the sun. I hope that you've enjoyed what you've seen so far with CCIM. In the United States where I'm from, it has truly made a huge career difference for thousands of people that have taken the course because of the decision-making processes that we bring to investors and to the understanding of their brokers so that they can help bring them better projects and help them maximize the dollars that they get out of the projects that they have currently. And with that, if there's nothing else, I'll get started and give you a little bit of information on what we have with CCIM. I don't know the level of sophistication that you folks bring to the class. And so with that, I'm going to cover a few of our basics before I get into a little bit of the user decision, because you can't do one without understanding the other. So, I'm going to be talking about some investment analysis tools, and truly the objectives of where I want to go here is just showing you a few things that are what investors look at for their decisions, as well as applying some of the decision-making tools to everyday numbers. We'll go on and we'll compare some of those investor decisions to how a user would look at it in using the case study that President Webb brought up yesterday in his speech, which is a property in Florida that was purchased by a Russian family from Moscow in the past year. So you can see how the two compare. The first thing we want to talk about is the cash flow model itself, which is where CCIM starts in our first course of 101. When we talk about the cash flow model, we know that users look at 4 distinct preferences. The first one is, how many dollars go in and when do I have to put those dollars in? Also, how many dollars come out and when? What is the timing that those dollars come in? These are the 4 investment questions that every investor that goes into a project asks, whether it's a new investment or an existing property that has income coming in. We keep track of all of this on what we call a T-bar. In other words, we track time on the left and money on the right. As long as we keep our timing correct, we will know the types of rates of return that will come back to the investor. Our cash flow model that we use at CCIM looks exactly like this. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we're always looking at our timing at the end of the year after we receive the money. And with our dollars, we start out in time period 0. That is that moment today that you go into the investment and you take that hard-earned cash that you have and you put it in. Then we track the cash flows either before or after tax for each and every year that we're in the investment, and then bringing in our last cash flow, which is those sales proceeds or the money that you might get at the end of the investment when you sell out or buy out of the investment itself. All of that, once we track those cash flows, if we know 4 of the 5 financial time, dollars in, dollars during the whole period, and dollars out, we can solve for the 5th, which is that rate of return or the yield or the interest that you made on your investment. The initial investment itself, when we talk about it, literally, there are several things that go into the initial investment. The first thing being the purchase price. What did you pay? The next thing being, did you have any other acquisition costs or money that you had to put down when you purchased the property? If you did get a loan or put debt onto the property, at that point you would also take any loan fees that you might have paid and add that back in. From there, if you did get debt, you would subtract that mortgage off, and with the remaining, what you would have is your initial investment, or the total down payment that you put in the day you purchased the property. From there, we look at those annual cash flows that come in. For this discussion, I'm going to be talking literally about American dollars, US dollars. You can translate them with a calculator. You guys, there's a lot of rubles to a dollar. But I'm going to be working with US dollars, and I'm going to be working before tax. So all things are equal. When we look at the annual cash flows that come in, we're looking at the potential rental income as if the property were 100% occupied, minus our vacancy factor or credit loss. With that, we'll have our effective rental income. We'll add any other income that those people might pay. They might pay towards taxes, they might pay parking fees for covered parking in a garage, that type of thing. And with that, we would come up with our, not only our effective rental income, we add the other, and with that we'll have our gross operating income. From our gross operating income, from there we'll subtract operating expenses. Those are those expenses that are unique to the property, not the investor. They would be everything from property taxes you might pay, maintenance and repairs you might have to make on the property itself. It's everything that is specific to the property. Property management fees, for those of you that might be in the IREM program, you know that property managers get paid, and typically the tenants will pay back for that, but somebody's got to pay the property manager. Once we take off those operating expenses, we'll come up with a really important line that investors always look at, and that's called net operating income. Net operating income is specific to the property and not the investor. It's used to value the property as to what a seller says it's worth, what a buyer says they're willing to pay, and by a lender as to what they will put on in the way of a loan. After that net operating income, after that you would take off your annual debt service if you did put debt on the property. And from there, you would come up with your cash flow before tax. Cash flow before tax is a number that you will also use to be able to interpret your internal rate of return or the yield that you make off of the property. And some of the other rules of thumb that we use when we're investors to figure out if this is a good investment or not. And that goes on to the T-bar for your annual cash flows each and every year that you receive income. Even if you have a negative return that year, you'll show that under your annual cash flow. There's one final cash flow. Come on in and have a seat. There's one final cash flow that you want to track, and that's your sales proceeds before tax. That's the money that you're going to receive at the end of the day when you sell out of that investment. From there, you would calculate a sales price minus the cost of sale. There might be brokerage fees that would be paid or other fees when you sell that property. And from there, you would pay off your mortgage if you had one or the debt that you might have placed on the property. And after that, you would have your sales proceeds before tax. That is the actual third number that you place on your T-bar. So in other words, we have the cash flow when you went in, which is typically negative. We have your cash flows from the years of ownership, and then we add in the sales proceeds. Once we have those, along with the years, 4 to 5, we can solve for the 5th, or solve for our yield, which gives us the fully filled in cash flow model. Now to come up with those numbers, we have forms. And this is a format that is universal in every end of the globe that we've done business in, from China to Russia to the US to, oh my gosh, Mexico and South America. We have 3 forms in CCIM. We have this one, which is called an annual property operating data sheet. Annual being the main word. We track all the numbers annually, not monthly. An APOD sheet, or an annual operating property data sheet, can be calculated based on historical numbers, current numbers, or future projected numbers. And investors purchase future income. They don't purchase what the owner got last year. They purchase what the owner is scheduled to get in the next year. The next form that we use is our cash flow analysis worksheet. This form is used to track those different years of ownership. In this particular case, I'm showing one that has 5 years. You could do 10 or 15 years if you wanted. Now, in this format, there is one area, the bottom line, that is probably the most important line on this form. And that's your checkbook. That's the money that you get at the end of the day, at the end of the year. And that is going to be used to figure out your total rate of return that you got on the property. The final form that we use in CCIM is called your alternative cash sale worksheet. And that worksheet can be done either before tax or after tax. I believe you have a value-added tax, do you not, in Russia that you pay on your properties? So in the United States, we call it income tax. In Russia, you call it value-added tax. So there are areas on this form, if you just follow the form, you can fill in the blanks to come up with those different numbers. So at the end of the day, if you were going to do your analysis after tax, you could actually calculate that without a lot of discomfort in doing that. In this particular case, we'll be starting with line 17 of the form and just working down to line 22. So, when we work with those forms, there are certain numbers that we will pull off. We'll pull off things like my potential rental income if the property were 100% leased. Or what is my net operating income? And we have what we call investment rules of thumb. And it's something that most of our investors use. The question is which ones of them do they use? Everybody uses something a little bit different. So as professionals, CCIM teaches you all the different tools so that you're prepared. Now, in the performance measures, the ones that I'm going to be showing you are before tax. With those, we'll be talking about a gross rent multiplier. I see some nods. Gross rent multipliers are most often used for people looking at multifamily. But the best thing about a gross rent multiplier is while it's simple, it's a way of comparing different markets. You can compare Moscow to St. Petersburg to New York, New York. It doesn't matter. It's a ratio between potential rental income and value. We'll also be talking about capitalization rates or cap rates. Cap rates work with a little bit more information than a gross rent multiplier because it works with operating expenses. It works with the net operating income. And it compares very much to the stock market in the way that it works like a P&E ratio. I don't know if that translates well. We're also going to be talking about the before tax, cash on cash, which is a 1-year look at cash flow that comes in. And then we're going to be talking about internal rates of return. And IRR is equal to yield. Some people call it the discount rate or opportunity cost. And what it really is, it's a way of looking at an investment from its totality, from the day you go in, all of your cash flows, and the money that you receive the day you sell the property. And the final one that we'll take a quick look at is a net present value, which net present value tells you how much more or less you would have to pay for a property to achieve your desired yield or your investor's desired yield. Hello, come on in, have a seat. Okay, gross rent multipliers. This is what the model looks like. It's a rule of thumb because if you know 2 of the 3, you can always solve for the 3rd. It's very easy to use. And the way it works is this. You have value at the top. You have a GRM on the left side, and PRI stands for potential rental income. If you go above and below the line, you divide. If you go across, you multiply. Very simple. So, the way that it works is this. The top is value. In other words, price. The GRM is a rate, and the PRI is potential rental income. So, if you knew your gross rent multiplier, which might be, you might be willing to pay 5 times the potential rental income, the question would be, if your value is equal to gross rent multiplier times potential rental income, then we would find out the value. And conversely, if you want to find out what the potential rental income would be on a property, you could take the value that they're marketing the property at, divide it by your client's required or desired gross rent multiplier, and with that, it would tell you the potential rental income. Now, it's simple, it's easy, it's a way to compare markets to market, but it's working off of potential rental income. That property could be 100% vacant, and it's still just potential rental income. It also doesn't take into account expenses. So, there are some other rules of thumb that might be a little bit better to work with, but let me show you how the numbers work on it. If we had a property that was for sale for $1,500,000 US, and with that it had potential rental income of $180,000. Using that rule of thumb for a performance measure, what it would say is I take my potential rental income, I would divide it, or pardon me, I would take my purchase price and divide it by the potential rental income, and that will give me my gross rent multiplier, which in this case, if I apply numbers to it, it comes up to 8.33. I'm paying 8 times that potential rental income for the property. Conversely, if you wanted to determine a purchase price, you could literally take the 8.33 and multiply it times the 180,000, and that would tell you the property is valued at 1.5. Simple? Easy? Let's go to a more complex and probably more highly used for investment property rule of thumb, which is called direct capitalization, or what we call cap rate. Now, cap rate is a little bit more involved because it works, the I on the ERV formula stands for income or net operating income. The R stands for the cap rate and the V stands for value. Again, if you go above or below the line, you're dividing. If you go across, you're multiplying. So with that, if you take net operating income and divide it by a cap rate, it will tell you in any market what your investor would pay for that property. So, formula-wise, if you want to find the income, but you know the cap rate that your owner or your buyer is willing to pay, and the value, then you can turn back around and say, this is the income that I would need to have on this property. If you have 2 of the 3, you can always solve for the 3rd. If you know the income and you divide it by the value, with that, you know the cap rate that they're trying to sell the property at. Cap rates are typically market driven, and the way they work is it's an inverse relationship. The higher the cap rate, the lower the value. The lower the cap rate, the higher the value. Worldwide, there's a shortage of really true institutional quality investment properties, and so we've found that cap rates are really low, getting lower and lower. But with lower interest rates that we've had around the world and the compression that's gone on with cap rates, it's a pretty expensive world out there. It's also a shortage of product because a lot of the investors are not willing to sell because it's hard for them to find something else to go into to earn the same income. Finally, if you want to find the value, if you know the income and you divide it by either the current market cap rate or your investor's desired cap rate, with that you'll come up with the potential value of the property. Capitalization rate, the best part about it is it works not necessarily with the potential rental income, but it works with the actual income coming in, and it takes into effect the actual operating expenses that have been paid for that year. So if we put the same numbers to it, where we had the assumption of a $1.5 million property, and we had that same potential rental income of $180,000, we would be taking off our vacancy as well as our operating expenses, and with that we'd come up with the net operating income, or NOI. So if we wanted to look at this as a measure of performance, we would sit down and we'd say, okay, well, after our operating expenses, we're going to net $122,852 US. If we divide that by the $1.5 million purchase price, we would find out that the property is valued at an 8.1 cap. Now, to determine a purchase price, we would do the same thing. We take the net operating income of the $122,000, and we would now divide it by the 8.1%, and you would find out the value of the property is $1.5 million. Many investors believe that cap rate is their yield on the property, and the facts are it really isn't. It's a ratio that goes between the two, And the only way it would be their actual yield on the property is if there was no growth in income, no growth in value, the property had no change in net operating income, then it would be the same. So, one other thing we take a look at when we're looking at it before tax, cash on cash, is one more rule of thumb, and it's a relationship between the initial investment, in other words, the cash you put in time period 0, and the first year's cash flow before tax. So if you look at that, in this particular example, after the debt service was paid, in other words, we got down to the net operating income, we took off our annual debt service that we paid for the first year, which would include principal and interest. We would find out that we would net a little bit over $32,000. If we took that $32,000 and we divided it by the initial investment, which in this case was $511,000 US, because we did put some debt, a mortgage on the property. If you took that and divided it, you would find out that the cash on cash in the first year was about 6%. It would give your investor a way of comparing that to some other investment that they might make, but again, it's a one-year comparison. If they can invest their money in some sort of savings or short-term investment and get 10 or 12%, all things being equal, the risk, well then maybe it would be better for them to go that way. But if what they're getting on their money is 2% and this gives 6% in the first year, it's an indicator maybe this is a pretty good deal. Most investors will lean a little bit heavier on one of these than another, but no investor should be investing millions of dollars into a property and just relying on one of these that looks at a one-year measure. It's just probably not a good sound investment thought process. So we have more. It's the CCIM way. We always have another way that we can analyze this. Come on in and have a seat. So let's take a look at internal rates of return. That's also known as IRR, or your yield. An internal rate of return, the definition, on an internal rate of return, it's the yield or the rate that each dollar earns, that it remains in the investment. In other words, it assumes that the investor is getting back their initial investment, the money they put in the property. It only measures the rate of what your earnings are. If you don't get all your original money back, then all you'd be measuring is how much money you lose, and that's not a very good investment. IRR isolates that profit, or those dollars that you are receiving over and above your initial investment. Now, and I apologize, these numbers are small, but so is the room, so this is a good thing. If we had that same investment of $1.5 million, and in this case, we're going to go ahead and have some acquisition costs of $30,000. It's those fees of purchasing the property. It might be the attorney or solicitor that has helped you get it. You may be paying brokerage fees, that type of thing. Then we are going to put a loan on. So we have some loan fees, as well as our mortgage that we get. So we're putting a total of $511,000 in. We then do a cash flow spreadsheet. We do an analysis. That's that cash flow analysis worksheet that I showed you, the second form. And what we do is each year that we own the property, we track it. How much money did I get in the way of potential rental income? Did I have any vacancy? Did I have any other income that came in the way of contributions from the tenant, or maybe cell sites, or anything else that might generate some additional income? With that, I get the total income I received. From there, I take off my operating expenses that are specific to the property. And that would give me my net operating income, which is right here. And you'll see that each and every year it's growing just a little bit, because in this example, there's a 3% annual income increase that's coming in. From there, we take off our annual debt service to reach our bottom line, which is line 22 of your cash flow analysis worksheets, to show you what your cash flow before tax is each and every year. Once we've done that, the last thing we've got to do is figure out our other cash flow, which is our sales proceeds before tax. So in this particular case, we decided that the property would sell in the future at a given cap rate. We capped it, came up with a future sales price of $1,644,000. We took off our cost of sale, and after our cost of sale, we paid off the remaining balance of our mortgage. And with that, we found out that we were going to get $686,000 in sales proceeds. You remember how much we put in? 511? Exactly. So we know we're going to have a pretty good return because we got cash flow every year, as well as we got more out than we put in. So with that, we can do a T-bar. That's that cash flow model that I showed you. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take from time period 0 to all 5 years that we own the property. And then we're just going to start adding the numbers in. We know that we put down $511,000. We took all the cash flows from each year of hold. And then we add our sales proceeds at the end. And once we have all of those, because of the time value of money, if we place those into a financial calculator that looks like this, we have negative dollars going out the first day we buy it. We have positive cash flows in the perfect world coming in each and every year that we own it. And we have our sales proceeds. If you put that into your financial calculator, you will find out that your yield, your IRR, the rate of return that you received on each dollar while it was invested, was right at 12.59%. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what do you think? Is that good enough? Well, you may come back and say, no, it's not. If I can't have at least 14% on my money, I don't want to take the risk and go into real estate. Because real estate is longer hold and it is riskier. Because it doesn't always go up. A recession proved that to us. So with that, what you could do is come back and say, well, if I want to get 14% on my money, the one thing we know, are we going to pay more or less for the property? Take a guess. Thumbs up for more, thumbs down for less. Nobody's playing. I'll sit down. No. The facts are, if you want a higher yield, you've got to pay less for the property. Yes?
Can we paraphrase that question maybe in a simple way for the audience?
Was that not simple?
I don't know.
The question is, if an investor wants a higher yield than what you're looking at right now, if the cash flows are fixed, because that's the income that's coming in for the tenant, there's only one thing you can do.
Make price lower.
You've got to make the price lower, exactly. Because if you can't change the annual income, and your future sales price is pretty fixed, then what you want to do is pay less for it today. And I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Now, if you're looking at the difference between cap rates and yield, because so many of our clients think that they're the same, I want to give you a little example. Now, this example is going to take about 2 minutes. When we teach this in CCIM, we spend about an hour and a half on this, so bear with me. I'm going to show you 3 different properties. And in CCIM, what we teach is that yield is actually the cap rate plus expected growth. Okay? Property A, in this example, you can buy it for $100,000. Okay? And it's got 10% income coming in the first year. If you use the formula, the formula we showed you of NOI, divided by either rate or value, it would give you the third. In this particular case, if you did it with $100,000 today and $10,000 out, what kind of return is that? That's pretty easy. What is that? 10%, right? Or in this case, it would be a 10 cap. The second property, B, has the same $100,000 today. However, its income in the first year is $5,000. If it gives you $5,000 out in the first year, what do you think that return is? It's a 5 cap, right? One would think that if you were going to buy something at a 5 cap, you're paying more for the property and getting a lower yield. So most investors would say, well, I want to buy something at a 10 cap versus a 5 because I'm going to make more money. Well, property C, people always have lots of options. It's the same $100,000, but this one in the first year gives you income of $15,000. If $10,000 is a 10 cap and $5,000 is a 5 cap, what's $15,000 out in the first year? It's a 15 cap, right? Now, what if at the end of the day, I sell property A for $100,000 after the first year? What's my yield? I have 0 growth, and so my yield is 10%. But property B, that in the first year I only got $5,000 out, what if I sold it for $105 at the end of the first year? If I had my 5 cap plus the growth of 5%, it's also a 10% yield. Interesting enough, property C, that most people would say, oh, I want that one, it's giving me the most amount of money. Let's say that that property at the end of the year only sold for $95,000, it actually lost value. That's a negative 5% growth. If you take the 15 cap minus the 5, you have exactly the same yield. And you can see in commercial property, typically we have annual or every 3 or 5 year increases in rents to keep up with the rate of inflation. And so with that, if you take your going in cap rate or your acquisition cap rate and add that growth to it, you know your internal rate of return is ultimately going to be higher, right, than the cap rate. Or if you're able to put leverage or debt on the property that is at a rate lower than this unleveraged amount, you can actually increase your yield too. Those are the things that we do in CCIM. Now, I told you with net present value, I was going to show you an easy way that we could calculate if that 12.69% return just wasn't good enough and we wanted 14. Net present value tells us if an investment is achieving its required yield. And so with that, we can actually, MPV can qualify it for us and tell us how much more or less we would need to pay at time period 0 to get the required yield for our investor. So if we took that same T-bar we talked about before, we watched those cash flows as they came through, and we found out that originally that one was at a 12.69%, and we said, no, that's just not good enough. I need a 14%. Net present value tells us how much more or less we would need to pay in time period 0 to achieve our desired yield. In this case, We tell it 14% on these cash flows, and it says no, negative $27,400 and some change. In other words, in time period 0, we have to pay less than the $511,000. How much less? $27,400, and then we would achieve the investor's desired yield. I am an investment broker. That's what I do for a living. I sell properties and I lease properties, and I specialize in office product. So if you have a long-term office lease, I'm the person that's trying to sell your buildings for you. And I have investors that purchase these types of properties all over. I use net present value as my preferred investment tool for my investors. I take the projected income, I apply their criteria to it and their risk, and then I look at what the net present value is to determine if this would possibly be in a price range that my investor would pay. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but it saves me hours and days of digging through a property to see if it might work for my investor. It's that gateway that says, hey, look a little further or just don't waste your time. So President Webb, yesterday, in his speech, talked about this property that was purchased by some clients in your market down in Florida in the last year. It's a fast food restaurant, which there are a lot of them in America. It's unbelievable. If there's anything, Americans like to eat a lot and they like to eat fast. And so with that said, this property was actually marketing for a price of $2 million. It also had rent of $150,000 a year that Arby's, the tenant that had this restaurant, was paying. There were annual escalations in the rent of 2.5%. The selling cap rate on the property was 7.5%. And it did sell for its offering price of the $2 million. The sale cap rate, when we did the projection of 5 years in the future, we projected it off of a 7 cap, thinking the market will get a little bit stronger and that the property will grow in value. And we figured that when they purchased the property, that their internal rate of return on the property was 10.79% because of that growth that was going to happen in the rent. When we look at the investment measures, because in the actual purchase of the property, the seller paid cash. So the gross rent multiplier, in other words, that potential rental income of $150,000, if you divided it by their purchase price of $2 million, it was a gross rent multiplier of 7.5. In other words, they paid 7.5% more for every dollar received. The capitalization rate was the NOI of $150 divided by the purchase price of $2 million, so the cap rate was also 7.5%. And the cash on cash in the first year, because the tenant was paying 100% of all the operating expenses, was 7.5. Not bad. It doesn't always work out that way. However, when we looked at the internal rate of return when the investor purchased the property, we wanted to track every dollar that they would receive for the 5 years, as well as using that 7 cap rate of what they would sell the property for in the future. So we looked at the cash flow and we said before tax, they paid $2 million for the property the day they went in. Their first year's annual income was $150, but then it grew by 2.5% each and every year. Plus, when they projected to sell the property at the 7 cap, they netted $2,363,000 and some change. when you apply the time value of money to that in a financial calculator, you found out that the internal rate of return, or that rate that each dollar earned each year, that it stayed in the investment of that $2 million they paid, earned a rate of 10.78%. Not bad. That's how it works. But there's a comparison that you want to do, and that is this. First, you want to look at your cash flow analysis worksheet, and you also want to be able to break out those sales proceeds. You don't want to just be guessing where they came from. Just use the forms. Or when you take the CCIM courses, you get the Excel spreadsheets that do all this for you. If this investor had said, you know, 10.78%, that's pretty good, but it's not good enough for me. I need a higher yield. I need 11.5%. You could take those same cash flows, then plug in 11.5% on the yield required, and solve for MPV, and you would find out you had a negative $56,000 and some change. It's a negative $56,000. Do they need to pay more or less for the property to get 11.5%? Got to pay that much less, right? That much less. Now you could sit there and suffer through and do all kinds of guesses, or you could just do this one application, and you instantly know where you've got to start going with it. Now, I want to show you a comparison. If the tenant had decided as a user in the building, maybe they should have purchased the property instead of signing a long-term lease and leasing back. This is an own versus lease analysis of which way is best. Now, in most cases, if you're the tenant in the property, you typically don't own the real estate because it's going to make you more money. You're in the real estate because that's where you need to be to do your business, and your core business is where you make money. In the case of Arby's, their core business is selling roast beef sandwiches. That's what they do. So with that being said, they could look back and say, well, whether I lease or whether I buy, I've got to pay for the space that I occupy. In other words, if I lease the property, I'm going to be paying rent to the owner. But if I buy the property, if I have to put some money down, but maybe I get a mortgage on the property or put some debt, I'll be making a payment, and I'm still going to have to pay to be there. But the question is, which one would cost me less? Which one costs me less? We have an analysis for that. We have two basic methods, and then we do some sensitivity after that I wouldn't bore you guys with today, or you'd throw me out of Moscow sooner than I want to leave. So with that, we have two methods. We're going to do the net present value method, and we have one other one that is the internal rate of return, or the IRR. Get this one, of the differential cash flow. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. It's a lot easier than it sounds. Okay. When we're looking at discounted cash flow method, what we're doing is we're taking all those future cash flows and we're discounting them back to time period 0 to try and compare the two piles of money and say which one costs me less. So we're going to estimate the cash flows each and every year as if I'm going to lease the property. We're also going to estimate the cash flows as if I own the property. And then we're going to calculate that present value of each one of those cash flows. Then we're going to compare them and pick the one that's less. So we have our case study, the same examples. We know what the tenant is paying in rent, so we might as well start there. Let's assume the purchase price of $2 million. Let's assume in our market, this tenant could purchase the property with $500,000 down. If they got a loan for the 101.5 million at 6.5% interest on a 20-year amortization, in other words, the bank gave them 25 years to pay the loan back. But we're going to assume that in 5 years they're going to pay the loan off and sell the property. So the hold period is 5 years. So what we do is we take an Excel sheet and we cast this out. We always start with the first numbers being if I were going to own the property. Because there's one thing we know about most users of real estate. If they're thinking about purchasing the property, they're really telling you they'd rather own it. And the question is, how much better or worse off would they be if they purchased the property? That's really the decision point that goes in. So if we take the cash flows, if we buy the property, we know in time period 0, we're going to put up $500,000. Then we know each and every year, net, what we have to pay in mortgage. This is what they're paying in their mortgage right now. And at the end of the day, at the end of the day, the only positive number on this T-bar is the sales proceeds that they get when they sell the property in 5 years. Other than that, everything's negative. So in that last year, we know when they sell the property and pay off the mortgage, even having paid that year in mortgage for their annual debt service, they'll get $883,000 and some change out. Then from there, we subtract the T-bar of B is actually, that's a rent. First year we know they paid $150,000. The next year it went up 2.5%, and the next year it did exactly the same. So what we're doing is we say, well, let's look at the present values of each series of cash flows. And we used a discount rate on this of 12%. And what we assumed was that their discount rate was 12%. Okay? So in that particular case, if you compare the two, which one is better? Which one costs them less at the end of 5 years? A or B? Which one costs them less if you're looking at the present values here? It's A. A costs them less. It's better to own than it is to lease. How much better? Almost $200,000. Yeah, it's almost 40% better to own it. What's the big number that makes the difference? It's that future sales price. It's also the riskiest on that T-bar because it's the only positive number. It offsets the cost of ownership. Now, one method would say, hey, it's cheaper to own. Now, if you don't have that $500,000, you can't own it. That's for sure. So the second thing that we do is we say, well, let's look at the differential. Let's look at the difference on that third T-bar. So if we took the cost of ownership and subtracted the lease cost from it, our third T-bar is over here on the right. And it shows all the dollar differences. We still had to put $500,000 in time period 0. And then you'll see the difference of each and every one. And what we say is, let's compare the IRR, or the internal rate of return, of that third T-bar to our discount rate. And when we're doing own versus lease, when we're doing that comparison, we say that if your discount rate If your discount rate is higher than the differential T-bar, then you should lease. But if your discount rate is lower than your differential T-bar, you should buy. In other words, you're making more money owning the real estate than you are selling roast beef sandwiches. If it was reversed here, and that IRR of the differential was actually 12% instead of 20%, then we'd say, hey, you know what? Maybe you should lease because you're going to make more money selling roast beef sandwiches. That's how we work in CCIM and doing comparisons of own versus lease. It's called user comparison analysis. And we do all kinds of other analysis on these numbers because we have to make the class last 4 days. No, I'm teasing you. But when we do our analysis, because of the sensitivity of this one positive number, which is the future sales price, we look at comparisons. Comparisons like, what is the sales price where it makes no difference if we sold or we leased, to see if that's realistic. Because understanding the numbers also means that you can unrealistically plug something in to make it look more attractive than what it really is. So you want to be sensitive to those numbers. If you end up taking CI 103, that's what we spend 4 days on in doing the analysis of what's the best negotiations for leases, using the time value of money, and then also working diligently on lease versus own analysis. Now, we talked about this. This is the synopsis of what I showed you as far as which one costs you less. They both cost you money. There's no way to make it free, right? But which one costs you less? Comparing it to the user's discount rate of the 12% and to the IRR of the differential. If they're making 12% on selling sandwiches, but 20% on owning the property, you want to own. If the difference is too great on every place that they go into, they might want to think about not selling sandwiches. I don't know. They might want to think about buying real estate. The real key is, do you make more money in your core business, or do you make more money owning the real estate itself? So those are the tools that we use when we're talking about user decision. Do you have any questions? I just talked a whole bunch of numbers, and boy, I'm sure this was just all kinds of fun. But are there any questions for those of you that have had CCIM or not had CCIM, as far as why or how we do this?
Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic, clear and professional presentation. Господа, есть вопросы?
Может, только по работе, Сузи Джонс, вопрос. Если у меня будет объект от собственника с 20% доходностью, за сколько, за какое время обычно идет инвестор у себя во Флориде? Часы это, дни, недели? Даже до 20 поднимем. Сколько часов?
That's a good question. You know, and it depends on the type of property.
От 500 до миллиона.
From $500,000 to $1 million. The property value is from $500,000 to $1 million, and it's 20% yield.
You know, it's interesting, and again, it depends on the length of the lease that's out there and the risk. In the market where I come from in the United States, if I had a property that was yielding 20% and it had this type of example with a true Class A type of tenant, that property would probably never make it to market. So I'd pick up the phone, call one of my investors, or maybe buy it myself, because I get less than 1% of my money in the bank, right? However, I've also had properties like this where it used to be an Arby's restaurant or a Class A tenant, and now it's gone vacant, and just the little local sandwich shop has gone in, it's a higher risk, and some investors say, I'm not willing to take the risk, even at a 20% return. But in the United States, debt is pretty easily obtained from banks and other forms of loans that are out there. And this analysis is something that we do for many of our users, some of them in large office buildings, and other ones in small restaurants. Because with interest rates as low as they are, it, for many of them, is much cheaper. And for long-term goals in appreciation of the buildings and retirement plans, they'll go ahead and buy the property. Just depends on the goal themselves. I would like to think that everything I listed sold like that. Unfortunately, not. I'm still a real estate broker. Any other questions?
Переведите мой вопрос. Я начал нашу презентацию с того, что рассказал, что 10-15 лет назад в нашей стране все, кто имели деньги, все покупали. Никто не арендовал. Было два объяснения. Общая нестабильность и фантастический рост цены недвижимости. Сейчас мы гораздо более стабильны. Инфляция ниже с каждым месяцем. И многие компании вырабатывают свою политику относительно того, покупать или арендовать. Мой вопрос следующий. Представим, в Соединенных Штатах большая сетевая компания. Супермаркет, фастфуд. Есть какие-то типовые сценарии для принятия корпоративного решения? Мы только покупаем свою недвижимость. Недвижимость для своего бизнеса.
Right.
Мы только арендуем.
Right.
Или в каждом городе, в каждом районе, каждый объект мы будем оценивать индивидуально и принимать индивидуальные решения.
That is such an easy question. Not. But it's a great question. It's a great question. Grocery store chains, many times, even if it's less expensive for them to lease, will purchase the property because it's about control. A lot of times they want to be able to control the property around them because they don't want people building pad buildings or blocking their visibility from the street. In different parts of the world, there are grocery stores almost on every corner, almost like gas stations and fast food. And then what they'll do is they'll build the grocery store in the back, and then they'll build pads in front. You'll have food or a liquor store or a restaurant, and they don't want that. So they'll buy the property to be able to control that development. However, a grocery store chain with a really great real estate department and analysts will watch the market. And when the market gets really looking like it's going to top out and values are going to top, what they'll do is they'll sign long-term leases, 20, 30-year, 50-year leases, sell the property at its height, and now lease back. That way, generating more cash to put back into their core business. Because the idea of controlling their real estate is they don't own They're not in the business of real estate. They're in the business of selling canned goods and produce. And so they'll try and market time the market. Many companies that are publicly traded, like in the stock market, their stockholders don't want them owning real estate because they want them paying them money, paying them dividends. And if they're holding the real estate, they're not paying dividends back out based off of their profits and the potential of what they could receive. And so many companies, when they can top out at the values of their real estate, will start selling it off too to improve their stock pricing. In America, a really great case study or example of this is healthcare. Our hospitals can be for-profit or not-for-profit, but most of the time what they will do is they'll build their own healthcare facilities. They'll build a large hospital and maybe 2 or 3 large office buildings that they lease to the doctors that work at the hospital. And then they'll sell the whole complex and do a sale leaseback. So they'll make all the money based off of the security that they're a good company.
Вопрос по ходу. Они продают независимым инвесторам.
So they build this and then they sell to the independent investors.
Exactly.
Независимым.
Or many times real estate investment trusts. So companies that sell stock, but all they own is real estate. And they're selling it based off of the rate of return.
Потому что я по собственному опыту работы знаю, когда большие сетевые компании создают собственные инвестиционные фонды.
I know many big grocery stores, big real estate, retail companies that have their own investment funds.
Yes.
Or real estate companies.
Yeah, or real estate companies.
И они
Like a CBRE or a JLL. Exactly.
И они продают, по сути, своей другой структуре.
So basically, they build it and they sell to basically themselves, right? To their other captive companies.
Exactly.
Разделяя бизнес на
So,
операционный
and therefore, they're splitting their core
Одна
activity
компания.
versus their,
и
the real estate management.
Exactly. Well, and that's that. It's the perfect world, isn't it? You find the tenant, you get paid a commission. Then you build the building, you're controlling the contractor, you're controlling the project management, you're doing the asset management. Now you've maximized your value. You go to your brokerage arm and you let Robin and I sell the real estate and pay us a commission again. And then you go out the back door and now you're still controlling the property and creating dividends for your investors. It's a perfect world until it's not. But typically, if you go with a really strong tenant, the stronger the tenant, the lower the rate of return. Because the lower the risk, the lower the rate of return. So a property like the one we used in our example, that was a 20% yield or a 10.78% yield, depending on whether they were going to purchase it themselves or you had the investor buy it. If that was actually a McDonald's or something with a much stronger credit, you may find that giving a yield of 5 or 6% instead of that almost 11%. But it's a much lower yield.
Последний вопрос. Покупать или арендовать? Это бизнес-кейс. Только для компании? Или частное домохозяйство решает точно такие же вопросы? И вечером на кухне финансовую модель.
Can you imagine being married and explaining this to your spouse? Having your children listen to this at the dinner table? No, I'm teasing. The concept works the same. The concept works the same.
Money is money.
Money is money, so it doesn't matter if you're analyzing 10,000 1 million or 10 million. The concept works the same. The difference being is if you're buying a home for yourself, typically the rate of return that you're going to get is truly based on the market. You can't track it to annual increases in rent, something like that. So with a home, if you're looking at profits, typically you're looking at the profit at the sales proceeds level. And in most markets in the world that we've analyzed, if you're looking at individual single-family homes or condos type of ownership, if you are renting them out to people and buying them as an investor, you're lucky if you break even. If you're leasing that property, typically you're going to have annual negative cash flows. And then your payday comes when you sell the property. And because of the time value of money, what might look like you made really great money might not be so great at the end of the day, because residential is more volatile than true investment grade commercial real estate. You agree with that?
Yes.
I figured you would.
Yes.
I said that just for you. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Вопросы?
Any other questions? Thank you. And if you guys get an opportunity, Robin Webb, Robin, stand up for a moment. Robin is the global president for CCIM. I think this is the first time we've ever had our global president come to a conference in Moscow, I think. So Robin, thanks for coming. Thanks for bringing me and letting me come. And thanks for letting me talk to you folks today. Thank you.
Thank you.